Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming. Early Tzedek intern Isaac here with Rabbi Yonatan Neril to discuss the Jewish approach to climate change. Rabbi Neril founded and directs the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. He's a co-author of the best-selling book, Eco Bible, published by the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, which shines new light on how the Hebrew Bible and great religious thinkers have urged human care and stewardship of nature for thousands of years as a central message of spiritual wisdom. He's spoken internationally on religion and environment, including at the UN Environmental Assembly in Nairobi, the Fez Climate Conscience Summit, and the Parliament of World Religions. He organized 10 interfaith environmental conferences in Jerusalem, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta. He's the lead author and general editor of 3 books on Jewish environmental ethics, and also co-authored 3 reports on faith and ecology courses in theological education. Raised in California, Rabbi Neril completed an MA and BA from Stanford University with a focus on global environmental issues and received your biblical ordination in Israel. So we are in for an absolute treat today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Rabbi Neril has to say. And stage is yours, Rabbi.
Thank you for the introduction. It's good to be here with you today. And thank you all for joining. I'm excited to share with you a Jewish perspective on climate change. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about for many years, and with the UN climate negotiations beginning in Glasgow later this month, it's a timely time to talk about how we're going to bring religion to bear to address the ecological crisis. Today, October 4th, is also a day when Pope Francis has gathered about 50 religious leaders in Italy for the announcement of a faith unity on climate change and for environmental sustainability. And today's also a day when faith plans for people and planet are being announced. And so that's another exciting initiative that's taking place out of London. So I'm going to do a screen share, and I'm going to share a presentation about religion and the ecological crisis. And you can see here that as was mentioned, about a year ago, I published Eco Bible Volume 1, an ecological commentary on Genesis and Exodus. And in about a month, we're going to publish Volume 2 on Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And in total, it's a commentary on about 400 verses that connects religion and science and provides practical action items. And so it's available in a number of different online platforms and in-person bookstores. I want to talk about a number of ships. And so I'm going to start. A man in a kayak, feeling quite cold, decides to make a small fire to keep himself warm. Within minutes, the kayak has a huge hole in it and sinks to the bottom of the lake, which proves you can't have your kayak and heat it too. So the first ship, I want to talk about 8 ships. The first ship is a ship that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai mentions in the Midrash, in the Jewish oral tradition. And he provides an analogy of people who were sitting in a boat. One of them took a borer or a drill and began boring a hole in the floor of the boat beneath him or her. And this person's friends said, "What are you sitting and doing in the boat?" And the person replied, "What does it matter to you? Am I not boring beneath myself?" They said to this person, "Your actions are of concern to us because the waters are rising through that hole and flooding the entire boat." And so here's one rendition of what was happening on that boat, where other people say, "Well, we're happy it's not on our end," although perhaps a more accurate depiction is in this cartoon, which shows the people saying to this person, "Lunkhead," and at the end of the day, the boat sinks, and then they're all in the water together. I mean, we're all in the same boat. This is from Leviticus Rabbah. So the Midrash links this to 2 verses from the book of Job. So said Job, even if I have erred, my error lodges within me. Job's friend said to him in response, for he adds rebellion to his error, among us he spoke, meaning you will bring punishment upon us for your sins. That the person's error doesn't just lie with them, but rather the error is a much bigger error and has much bigger consequences. So I want to ask a few questions for the purpose of our sort of thought exercise together and trying to understand at a deeper level this Midrash. Why is the person drilling underneath their own seat? Can you think of a rational reason for this behavior? In other words, it's possible to think that the person is crazy, that the person is psychotic, and therefore, how could it be that they're drilling underneath their own seat? But actually, Rabbi Shimon doesn't give a reason for why this person is drilling. And so we can sort of use our imaginations to think about why this may be. And I'll just provide a few ideas. One would be to fish. Maybe the person is hungry and the person doesn't have anything to eat and doesn't have a means to get food except by putting a hole underneath their own seat. A second possibility is that the person wants to cool down his or her feet, that they're on a tin ship and it's a hot day, and by drilling a hole, they can get some water to cool down their feet. A third possibility is that they want to get fresh drinking water. They're on a fresh water body of water like the Sea of Galilee, and they again don't have bottles of water available. So by drilling under their seat, they're able to access water. And a fourth possibility would be to drill for oil or other non-renewable resources. This is a picture of an oil platform relatively near land, which you can see in the background. There are now oil platforms, gas platforms off the coast of Israel. And as you're aware, the Gulf of Mexico has hundreds of such platforms, as well as huge amounts of oil infrastructure under the sea, pipelines. So another possibility is the person wants to harvest seaweed to go with the fish that they caught. Maybe they brought some rice on board and they want to make sushi. And they also brought some soy sauce and ginger, wasabi. Or perhaps the person needs to go to the bathroom. They want to use the facilities, and this is their only way to do so. They, for one reason or another, were not able to find another bathroom on the ship. So those are all rational reasons for why a person might drill underneath their own seat. So a second question that I want to raise for us is, what accounts for the disregard of other people's welfare? In other words, why doesn't the person think about the other people on the ship and how their action might impact others? So one idea is that they think a small hole won't cause real damage. They think that they're just drilling a small hole and it's a big ship and it won't sink the ship, so it's justified for them to do that. A second possibility is they can't think about anything beyond their immediate need, that they have to drink, they're very thirsty, and this is what they need to do. And they just can't think about the future or the consequences of their action because this is their immediate need. A third possibility is they think the problem is long-term. If the ship sinks, it won't happen for a long time. And by the time they're off the ship, then maybe the problem will develop. But while they're on the ship, they don't have to worry about it. So live and let live. Drink and be merry. So a third question that I want to raise for us in this thought exercise that we're doing together is, what can the people on the ship do to convince this person to change their behavior? In other words, you might think that the person the others on the ship could tie the person up. They could, lock the person in a room. Those are more violent actions. And I've been influenced by a book by Marshall Rosenberg called Nonviolent Communication, and would like to think, how can the person help to change this person's behavior without doing something violent, either without screaming at the person or tying them up. So one possibility is they can try to meet the person's needs in a way that does not involve drilling. If the person's hungry, they can give the person food. If they're thirsty, they can give them water. The second possibility is they can explain the person's action will harm that person as well. They're not on this ship alone, but rather they also have to face the consequences of their action. And they should, if they're not concerned about other people, they should at least be concerned about themselves. If they're an egoist or a narcissist, then they can think about their own welfare. They're not only thinking about the welfare of, they're not thinking about others, but they can at least think about themselves. So another possibility is they can tell the person that their action impacts other people, that actually they should care about other people. That's part of being a good human being, is not just thinking about ourselves, but thinking about others. So those are a few questions that come out of this Midrash of someone drilling underneath their own sea. So this is ship number one. The second ship that I want to talk about is Noah's Ark, which in the Jewish Torah portion is the weekly reading. Interestingly enough, last week Jews read the Torah portion of Genesis, Bereshit, and part of chapter 2 was also read in the Christian lectionary reading. So it was a rare time when Jews and Christians read the same piece of the Hebrew Bible on a weekend. So Noah's Ark, you're all familiar with the story. And why didn't Noah go fishing? Because there were only 2 worms. And if he used one of the worms to fish, then the worms couldn't reproduce. Which animal was Noah distrustful of? He was distrustful of the cheetah. He was afraid it was going to cheat him. What did the people of Noah's generation do to trigger God to destroy almost all life on earth? Well, this is a question that I've thought about because it's the only time in the Torah where God says that God will destroy all life on earth, except for that which was on Noah's Ark. And no other time in history has God done that. So, and the question is, well, what was so bad about that generation? What did they do that was worse than any other generation in history? So there's a Midrash from the Jewish tradition about stealing peanuts at the market. And it talks about how in Noah's generation, people would go to a market and they would take a peanut from a vendor and they'd eat it. And then they go to the next vendor and they take an almond and they'd eat it. And they'd go to another vendor and they would eat it. And what this is telling us is that, so then the vendor actually call the police. And the police would say, well, I'm sorry, sir. They'd say to the vendor, I'm sorry, but unfortunately, we're not able to prosecute this person because the cost of a peanut is less than a penny, and our justice system doesn't have the ability to prosecute people for doing something that's where they're stealing less than a penny. And so here's a picture from the Machane Yehuda market in Jerusalem that small acts matter. I remember when I was a kid, I used to go to the supermarket and I would take a gummy worm and eat it. Now today, gummy worm is probably cost like 25 cents. So it's not just a penny, but there's this idea that essentially in the aggregate, if we do small acts in the aggregate, then that adds up. And that was why God decided to destroy Noah's generation. That's one idea that we can take from Noah's Ark. Actually, while we're on the topic of Noah's Ark, I'll also just mention that you could think of the Ark as a green building, that the Ark was a ship that had, the Torah says that God said to Noah to make it 3 stories. The top story was for people. The middle story, according to the Talmud, was for animals, and the third story was for excrement or waste. And the question is, why did God say to build an ark with 3 stories, of where the rabbis understand that to mean of people, animals, and then waste? Why couldn't have Noah and his family just thrown overboard the waste from their own waste and from the animals? The whole world was going to pot, to hell in a handbasket, and so you would think that would have been okay. In our times, cruise ships they release huge amounts of sewage and non-biodegradable waste into the ocean. And so one idea is that Noah was an ecologist. He was an environmental steward, and he didn't want to throw the waste overboard. To demonstrate his sustainability credentials and principles, to put them into practice. A second possibility is that Noah wanted to save the waste, because one of the first things he did when he left the ark was he made a vineyard. He planted a vineyard, but the thing is that the flood likely washed away a lot of the topsoil, as flooding can do. And so therefore, Noah, unfortunately, he had to replenish the topsoil. And the way that he did that for the small vineyard that he planted may have been by taking the compost that he made from this mostly animal manure, and then, which had been there composting for a year, and which was good soil at that point, and then he used that as to replenish the topsoil. So those are some ecological principles that we can learn from Noah's Ark. Another one is the Torah says it had a tzohar, which meant likely, according to one interpretation, a natural light, and so they didn't have to burn olive oil to get lighting on the ark, because they needed sunlight at least when the rain stopped. So the third ship that I'd like to talk about is Jonah and the repentance of Nineveh. Now, you're likely familiar with the story from the book of Jonah, that God told Jonah to go prophesy to the people of Nineveh. Nineveh is in modern day Iraq, near the city of Mosul in Kurdistan. And Jonah didn't want to fulfill that prophecy for one reason or another. So God brought a storm on the ship, and Jonah told the sailors to throw him overboard. And they did, and then he ended up in the belly of a whale. Now it's interesting because Jonah was in a place of small-mindedness. He didn't want to do the prophecy of God. And God then brought him to a place of big-mindedness. What in the Kabbalistic tradition, he went from mochin dekatnut to mochin degadlut. And we can see here, what animal has the largest brain? Well, a lot of people think that a human being has the largest brain, but actually it's a sperm whale. A sperm whale is the animal in the world with the largest brain. So you essentially, and as we know, neuroscientists say that in our stomach, there can also be a brain. So essentially Jonah had to go into the stomach of the largest animal, but the animal and the one with the largest brain, in order to come to a place of accepting God's call for him to prophecy. Now, when he went to the leaders and the people of Nineveh, why did they change their behavior? In other words, just because a foreign prophet comes doesn't mean that they're going to listen to him and repent and change whatever evil ways they were engaged in. What was different about Jonah? The Midrash says that Pharaoh survived the splitting of the sea and became the king of Nineveh. And Pharaoh had seen what God was doing, what God did when Moses showed up and said, you need to let the people go. And according to Midrash, Pharaoh was the only Egyptian to survive the splitting of the sea, and that he fled and became the king of Nineveh. Now he repented and caused Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, to change course. That was because he knew that if God says to repent, you need to repent. And if not, then God is serious, and you have to, and there will be serious consequences to not changing course. So the fourth of 8 ships that I want to talk about and conclude in about 20 minutes, and then open it up for questions and comments, is the Titanic. And you're all familiar with the story of the Titanic. The Titanic had an equivalence of 46,000 horsepower. So it's a metaphor for industrial society. By comparison, today, Air Force One has a 240,000 horsepower. Now, Captain Smith was warned about the icebergs ahead. So why did he sail full steam ahead? This is Captain Smith here on the right with these medals. He was one of the most celebrated captains in the early 20th century. And it's a bit puzzling because there were 11 ships that warned him, including the LSS California. Why did he sail full steam ahead? There was apparently a large ice patch there. Now, one reason is that nature was different than he expected. He didn't expect there to be icebergs in that part of the North Atlantic in April, since there usually were not. 1912, however, was the most intense winter in that area in 30 years. And therefore, the Titanic sailed into an ice pack that was 100 miles long and 100 miles wide. The other 11 ships that were in the ice pack had apparently got there during the day and seen it. And then they just, put anchor and they didn't move. And they radioed the Titanic saying we're in a huge ice pack. They didn't realize how big it was, but each ship could see, on its own that there was an ice pack around them. Now, Captain Smith also thought the ship was unsinkable based on the belief that industrial society is stronger than nature, that this ship could not be sunk by nature. It was stronger than nature, and therefore, what is an iceberg? An iceberg is just a small thing, and this belief was reinforced by the fact that no ship like it had been sunk by an iceberg. So they thought that it was invincible. In addition, Captain Smith thought he'd be able to avoid a collision in time, yet they only had 35 seconds after spotting the iceberg. In other words, Captain Smith actually went to sleep that night. The philanthropist on the deck put a big dinner in his honor for his prowess as a captain, and he was eating prime rib and drinking wine, and then he went to sleep. So there's a second lieutenant, but there was a watchman on the deck who saw the iceberg. And when he did, he radioed to the control tower, and they started to turn the ship, but they only have 35 seconds after seeing the iceberg before they hit the iceberg. Now, people on board that assumed that the captain was taking care of them, but they didn't realize that he was actually eating prime rib and cocktails right before the iceberg, the Titanic hit the iceberg. So here's a picture of the Titanic on the sea, the biggest ship ever built in that time, 1912. Here's a picture of it hitting the iceberg at 11:40 at night. And here's a picture of it discovered in 1985 on the bottom of the sea in the North Atlantic. Here's here's the hull. And in here is the interior of it, the grand room where the band played until the end. So
Another idea is that the Titanic was in a race to get across the transatlantic. And the question is, why the need for speed? Why did it go so quickly? And why was it sailing, especially at night? So the transatlantic passenger ship business was competitive and captains tried to ensure an on-time arrival. So therefore, it was actually normal for them to be trying to sail as fast as they could. Just like it's normal when you get on a plane after takeoff, that the captain says, I'm going to try to, to go a little fast here so that we get you there before, the expected arrival time. Even though in our times that actually uses more fuel to go faster, just like driving a car at higher speeds uses more fuel. So this is now a fast pace of work also characterized Boeing's development of the 737 MAX 8, which is pictured behind me. As an engineer for Boeing said they weren't going to stand by and let Airbus steal market share. And so with the Boeing 737 MAX 8, they were also rushing the development process. This is me standing on the tarmac at the Tel Aviv airport in 2019, and I flew from Tel Aviv to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and then from there to Nairobi. I flew on the day that the Ethiopian Airlines flight crashed when it was departing from Addis Ababa. And so I'm sharing this with you to say how grateful I am to be alive and to continue to be able to share the teachings on religion and ecology as I'm sharing with you today. Baruch Hashem, I wasn't on that flight, and it's a tragedy for those who were. Another modern example of the effects, the consequences of the need for speed was the BP oil spill in 2010, where the teams of BP and Halliburton had a rush to extract oil, and that was a key factor in contributing to the series of errors that caused the spill and killed a number of people on this oil rig and released huge amounts of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. It was the largest spill in history, much larger than the Exxon Valdez. Interestingly, Hurricane Ida hit Louisiana and the Gulf Coast about 5 weeks ago, and that led to 55 oil spills from oil rigs and other pipelines in the Gulf of Mexico. So just as the Titanic hit an iceberg that was 90% below their perception, so too in our current crisis, we only see the surface of the problem: fossil fuels, climate change, and more. Yet the underlying issues are much deeper: greed, apathy, arrogance, and instant self-gratification. And this is what I want to focus in the last part of what I'm going to share with you. The Rashba said that if you address the root issues, then the peripheral issues will fall away. Yistalek ha'ikar, nistalek ha'tafel. And as Henry David Thoreau said, for every 100 people hacking at the branches of the tree of evil, one person's hacking at the roots. So ship number 5 is planet Earth. And we can think of planet Earth as a ship. You can think as the atmosphere is the bottom of the ship. The global carbon emissions from fossil fuels have been rising very significantly since 1900, although the bulk of the rise is since 2000. You can see here that since 2000, we've been putting 6,000 million metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere each year. And because of that, whereas in 1900, we were putting only 800 million metric tons. And so we're putting about 8 times as much now, although now we're putting something like 12 or 13,000. It's like, this is just up to 2010. And so as a result, half of the carbon that's in the atmosphere now is from just the last 20 years, this amount of carbon. Airlines flew more than 4.3 billion passengers in 2018, up from fewer than 500 million 2 decades earlier, and passengers increased over 800% in 20 years. So even though the climate crisis is intensifying, it's intensifying because we're intensifying it. We are consuming more as the years go on, and the human population continues to increase. This is a graph that shows per capita CO2 emissions, which in the US is the highest. The EU is over half of the US, and here in Africa, it's about 1/10. So it's not evenly distributed around the world. And so another thing to keep in mind is that science has actually been conservative in regards to climate change, that nature is different than we expected, and scientists underestimated the severity and pace of climate change. One scientist who got it right was the lead US climate scientist, Dr. James Hansen, who's actually warning that the pace of climate change is going to intensify in the next 2 decades, just like it's intensified in the past 5 years. Philanthropy has also been conservative. Larry Kramer, president of the Hewlett Foundation, said about 2% of total philanthropic giving for a problem that is unquestionably the single largest challenge facing humanity is crazy. And that still continues to be the case, that 98% of philanthropy goes to museums and universities and hospitals and other issues, whereas actually religious institutions get the highest percentage of philanthropy, whereas addressing a sustainable planet is only 2%, a sustainable humanity. Yet climate change can be linked to many other issues. We've essentially created a series of icebergs that we are now colliding with year after year, in the form of drought, which is something that we've been experiencing here in the Middle East, in the form of floods, which were pronounced in many places. The subways of some major Chinese cities flooded in recent months, as did in Manhattan. And so to sort of bring this teaching together, we're all drilling small holes on the collective ship through our daily consumption. And the advertising industry has a significant role to play in that. Each of us acts rationally to meet our needs and desires, yet together our actions are crazy and destructive. In other words, it's crazy what we're doing to the earth, yet each of us, especially in the Western world, is drilling holes on the collective ship, and we all have rational reasons to do that, whether it's to fly or to drive or to eat meat or dairy or eggs or fish. And so the solution to egoism is spirituality. So ship number 6 is the Mississippi River barges. About 2 years ago, there was a great Midwestern flood, and the barges bringing fertilizer, which is made from fossil fuels, weren't able to bring it on the Mississippi because it was so high. So this is an example of how climate change is also impacting the shipping industry and ships. So the earth is messaging, shape up or ship out. Business as usual is no longer possible. Here's a picture of a barge that wasn't able to sail on the Mississippi for a good period of time. So ship number 7 is Greta's solar ship and the young people's awakening. As you likely know, Greta Thunberg of Sweden began a whole youth climate strike. Here in Jerusalem, a young woman recently did a climate hunger strike outside of the president's residence. So young people in particular are waking up to the challenge at hand. And you could think of Greta Thunberg as sailing the ship of choice of the global climate movement, Stop Denying, because we need as it says here, skipping climate change is worse than skipping school. And a lot of young people are saying, I don't care about reading, writing, and arithmetic if the fundamental basis for all life on this planet is being undermined by our lifestyle. And young people, perhaps they're less numb to reality, and they're more sensitive to the situation that we're in, they are really probably the most prominent voice for change on the planet at this point. More so, I would even say, than religion, which I'll get to in a minute. Now, how can people act now to avert danger in the future? So ship number 8 is the soul. And here's a person standing like a tree with their arms in the air, receiving the light, appreciating the beauty of God's creation. The ecological crisis is not only about the birds and the bees, the trees and the toads, it's also about the soul and how we live as spiritual beings in a physical reality. And the Zohar teaches that the soul is a ship, and the soul is trying to navigate the rocky waters of life, and it thinks of the soul as a ship, as a sfina. So religious teachers can help us to think long term, to moderate consumption, and to find greater pleasure in the spiritual and communal. That's the role of religious leaders. However, for the past many decades, religion has not gotten fully on board in addressing the ecological crisis. Are rabbis and other clergy making enough effort to teach on this topic? I venture to say that they're not. And there was a recent survey of American clergy that was conducted by Reverend Leah Shade, who's a professor at Lexington Theological Seminary. And she found that only about half of American clergy speak about environmental issues. Only 3% speak about species extinction. And the frequency with that clergy speak about this is not commensurate with the severity of the crisis that we're facing. That you would think that, on the Titanic, everyone should be focused on steering away from the iceberg, and all the other efforts, the symphony, the restaurant, the philanthropist gathering, all those other efforts are secondary or even irrelevant in the face of an existential threat. And yet, amazingly, humanity has not been able to muster the focus to make sustainability the number one priority. And religion is partly to blame for that, because religion is supposed to focus us on the most important issues, and yet religion is also focused on a host of other issues, including, if you just look at how much energy, for example, the Jewish community spends on fighting anti-Semitism, that makes focus on climate change pale by comparison. So the organization that I direct, the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, and its Jewish Eco Seminars branch, engages clergy to teach and preach more on religion and ecology. We've held 12 interfaith environmental conferences, half in Jerusalem and half in the United States. And we're especially trying to encourage houses of worship and clergy to engage more on the topic of religion and ecology. Clergy can inspire people to appreciate altruism rather than physical consumption, to be net givers instead of net takers, which is important also because the act of giving can activate the area of the brain associated with positive feelings, lifting your spirits and making you feel better the more you give, according to studies. So it's not just about ecology, it's also about how we feel. Sustainability and spirituality go together. We're also working in Africa to develop a commercial scale solar field on church lands in Mozambique, in what we call the Faith-Inspired Renewable Energy Project. This is our project manager, Philippa Friedland, with the governor of one of the states in Mozambique. So in terms of what can we do personally, try to bring the theology into a practical place. We can compost, we can decrease meat and dairy consumption, especially of cow's milk and beef. We can decrease air travel, buy in bulk, reuse and reduce, and rethink whether we even need to use a product, because recycling is really a last resort. It's not, even though a lot of people think that recycling means you're a card-carrying environmentalist, the better ways to approach it is to reduce and reuse and rethink and reconsider whether we even need, a can of Coke in the first place. Bicycle, walk, and use public transportation instead of taking a personal automobile. Those are some other suggestions. So Earth to humanity, we can't take the slow boat to China on climate change. Winning too slow is losing, as Bill McKibben said. We're all on the same boat, and we need all hands on deck, especially the 6 billion people that identify with a religion. That's 85% of people on Earth. We also can't trust that the captain will save us, because in these 5 pictures of the male leaders or former leaders, they may not have our best interest in mind, as each of these leaders of Canada, Brazil, Australia, Russia, and the former president of the United States were all pro oil to varying degrees, oil, gas, and coal. Especially the 4 of them. Trudeau a little bit less, but he also promoted oil and gas and shale tar sand development in Canada. The question is not, did my actions change the world? The question is, did I do everything in my power when everything was at stake? That's the question. What are we doing? What we can when everything matters? And even if it's, the science is wrong, although 98% of climate scientists are in agreement that we have to address climate change, we have to do it now, then we'll still create energy independence, preserve rainforests, promote sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, renewables, clean water, healthy children, etc. And it's about prioritizing our efforts. As I said, if the Jewish community succeeds in fighting anti-Semitism, yet fails in climate change, then we will have ultimately failed. And it goes for essentially all the other efforts. We might have the most beautiful museums and the most interesting museums, but we need to make this our number one priority. And I'll finish with a story that the Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, of blessed memory, told of a young boy who comes to an elder woman with a bird in his hands. And he says to the woman, "Can you tell me whether the bird in my hands is alive or dead?" And she thinks to herself, and she realizes that the boy is playing a trick on her. Because if she says that the bird is dead, the boy will open his hands and release the bird, and she will be wrong. And if she says the bird is alive, the boy will close his hands and crush the bird, and she'll be wrong again. He's got her coming and going. So the woman thinks to herself for a minute, and she says to the young boy, "I don't know whether the bird in your hands is alive or dead. All I know is that the life of the bird, the fate of the bird, is in your hands." So thank you for participating, and I would be happy now to open it to questions and comments from those here on Zoom.
That was incredible. Thank you so much, Rabbi. So we have a few questions. The first of a few, I believe, is from Debbie from the audience.
Hi, Rabbi. Thank you so much. That was awesome and informative, and really a pleasure to be here today. Thank you. I am part of an Orthodox community, which tends to be very insular and only deal with imminent issues. And when there's fires, we leap, but we tend to only deal with what we deal with. What do you think the reason is that I can only speak to an Orthodox community because it's my only involvement, unfortunately. But what do you think the reason is that climate change and its impact is not even dealt with on any level? It's never mentioned.
Yeah, well, I would say that there's a couple of reasons, and I would also broaden it to it's not just Orthodox Jews. There are also conservative Christians and conservative Muslims who seldom talk about climate change, or actually in some ways are believe in that fossil fuels are a positive force for humanity. I think one reason has to do from the fact that the environmental movement emerged in the 60s and 70s out of the sort of the hippie movement and of free love. And when that happened, a lot of conservative religious people came to associate ecological awareness with hippies and free love. And even though the environmental science, within academia has come to show with clarity that what we're doing to the earth is really terrible and debilitating and threatens us and all 8 million species that God created. But there's still a residue that I think many religious people have with the environmental movement and with environmental science. A second reason I think relates to the that many religious people who read the Bible, either literally or have a certain approach to the Bible, some of them are skeptical of science. And this has come to the fore to some extent with the coronavirus pandemic. But the gap between religion and science that plays out in a general way, in particular, plays out with environmental science. That a lot of people are very sympathetic to the 2% of climate scientists who are skeptical, while discounting the 98% of climate scientists who say that we have a consensus and that we need to do something about this. A third factor, which actually to me is probably the most compelling, is that I believe that a lot of religious practitioners and clergy have, to a certain extent, made a deal with the devil in regards to materialism and the ascendance of consumer society as the driving and the central force in modern society. And what I mean by that is that they've essentially said, look, let's try to preserve religion and rituals, and let's just focus religion on, on Bible study, text study, rituals, and we're not going to challenge outright the prominence of materialism and consumerism in the lives of religious people, because if we're going to address climate change, we need to take consumer society. We need to challenge it. It can't. If climate change is a result of the ascendance of consumer society, and so therefore, it's not that people deny the climate science, because it's sort of like saying that they deny dental science or medical science or or like the tobacco industry, that they deny the connection between smoking and cancer. At a deeper level, what people are denying is that we need to change our lifestyle. People don't want to change their lifestyle, especially a consumer-centered lifestyle. And therefore, by denying climate change and by staying silent, for clergy to stay silent about this is a way of tacitly letting consumerism continue to be the central force in people's life.
Unfortunate.
Yeah.
Unfortunate, but thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi. So I think we have another question right now from Pam, and here.
Hi, thank you so much for this. So my question is, you said I think only 2% of philanthropists give for climate change initiatives. So how can we engage them more to give more money for this versus other causes? And do you know why that is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a great question. And it actually relates to what Debbie was just saying. I would encourage you, Debbie, to go to the rabbis in your Orthodox congregation and to say why I just heard a webinar. I'd like to hear you speak about this topic and to actively encourage them, together with other members of your congregation who care about these issues, to say to the clergy, this is important for me. The UN climate conference is coming up. I'd like to hear you speak about this more often. And in regards to your question about philanthropy, I would say a similar thing. If you know wealthy people, then encourage them to divest their investments from fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy companies, and to reorient their philanthropy to addressing a sustainable future. In terms of why only 2% of philanthropic giving goes to address the climate crisis, I think that it's part of it has to do with sort of the way that philanthropy is, for some people, a way to get their name on a plaque or on a building. I'm just being honest with you. I'm not beating around the bush, because so therefore, if someone can have their name on a plaque at a hospital or a museum or a university, that is very gratifying to the ego. And the environmental causes, like most environmental organizations can't offer you a plaque at a wing of a university, prestigious university. It's saving the planet will be rewarded by our children and grandchildren, and 8 million species will be rewarded by God, but giving to address the ecological crisis does not get you a plaque in the same way it does for houses of worship, universities, museums, and hospitals.
I think also the fact that the urgency is not imminent right now, people don't think past tomorrow. It's not relevant now. So they're not going to leap because they say, yeah, it'll later. They don't realize that later's coming. And I think that's part of the problem. People leap when there's an emergency. They don't just kind of say, yeah, it's fine. I'll get through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, less than a week ago, Jews finished the reading of the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy. And one of the themes of the book of Deuteronomy is Moses saying, think l'orach yamim, think long term.
Right.
And that's one of the key messages. And that actually relates also to your question, Debbie. There's also, I think, a belief among some religious people that God or the Messiah will take care of the ecological crisis and sort of wave a wand and it'll all go away and it'll all be fine. And there's a belief that's one theological belief that some people have, which I think is a tenuous and very dangerous theological belief. Another belief that they have is that it's not possible for people to change the climate or to degrade the earth, because only God can do that. It's too big a scale. And who are we to think that people could affect God's creation? Which, for those who read environmental science, it's clear. Well, of course, 8 billion people who are consuming the way we do can do that. But, some people, and it goes back to Jonah, of sort of moving from this place of small-mindedness to big-mindedness. And that's why the ecological crisis is really a crisis of spirituality. It's a crisis of religion. It's not really a crisis of the environment. It's about, is humanity going to be able to raise its level of spiritual awareness? Consumer society encourages us to operate at the lowest level, which is called nefesh shebenefesh, the most physical level of soul awareness. But in order to live in balance with God's creation, we need to raise our level of soul awareness so that we care for other people, we care about the future, and we care for God's creation.
I believe we have one more question from Cody.
Hi. What would you say to the kind of person who says, I want to do the right things about climate change, I want to make the right decisions, but it's probably too late anyway, and I'm just one person, and other people are just going to do what they want anyway? What do you say to them?
Yeah, so it's an important question, because some people think we don't have a problem at all, and some people think that the problem is so terrible that there's nothing we can do about it. The first group of people think, we don't have a problem at all, and therefore we don't have to do anything about it. The other people think the problem is so bad that there's nothing we can do about it. Now I'm in between, and I'm sort of based on the views of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who said, he said, if you believe that it's possible to degrade, then believe that it's possible to repair. And I'm also of the another teaching of Rabbi Nachman is ein yeush ba'olam klal. Never give up hope. Don't abandon the possibility that we can make change, because and we, as I said, we have to do everything we can. Even if we only have 35 seconds until we hit the iceberg, and we got to do what we can. With the Titanic, about a third of the people survived. So, that relates to resilience, and how do we make our communities more resilient. But, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs talks about how hope is the belief that we can change our situation, that we don't have to be stuck in the same mistakes, because, part of our situation is about an addiction to consumer goods, to fossil fuels, to white sugar, unhealthy foods, etc. But we don't have to stay addicted. We can raise our spiritual level, and in the process, when we become more sustainable, we become more spiritual, and we become more spiritual, become more sustainable. So never give up hope, keep hope alive.
All right, I think that's all. That was an amazing, informative session, and thank you so much, Rabbi. It was unbelievable. And thank you to everybody who came and to everybody who will eventually view this. And I believe that Rabbi Neril just attached a link to his book in the chat, which I haven't gotten to yet, but I certainly will very soon.
You're welcome. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.